President Trump announcing Intel has agreed to give the U.S. government a 10% stake in the company. Joining us right now, talk about that and so much more. We're going to talk about Chair Powell and everything else. White House National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett. Kevin, it is great to see you this morning. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So here's the question. Ronald Reagan famously said the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Right? You remember that line, and it's
Sure.
a line that I think it's been used by Republicans for the last several decades, until maybe Friday. Can you explain the rationale behind taking this 10% stake?
Right. Well, it's not really a taking, right? The bottom line is that because of the CHIPS Act, the U.S. government had decided to give a whole bunch of money to Intel. And the President Trump and Howard Lutnick, Secretary Lutnick, talked to Intel about the progress they were making in the hurdles that they had to hop over in order to get the money. And I don't think they're particularly happy with that progress. And so in the end, they worked out a deal where Intel is going to get the CHIPS money, but in exchange, we're going to get some equity. And equity is not voting, so there's not going to be government intrusion into the business of Intel. It's more like a down payment on a sovereign wealth fund, which many, many countries have.
Kevin, though, is this the beginning of a larger effort by the U.S. government to take equity stakes in other industries that we subsidize or other companies in the AI and chip space that we subsidize? So a good example is AMD. Another example might be Taiwan Semiconductor.
Right. Well, I think this is a very, very special circumstance because of the massive amount of CHIPS Act spending that was coming Intel's way. But the president has made it clear all the way back to the campaign that he thinks that in the end, it would be great if the U.S. could start to build up a sovereign wealth fund. And so I'm sure that at some point there'll be more transactions, if not in this industry, in other industries.
OK, so we should expect the U.S. government to be taking more equity stakes in businesses around the country. That is something that if you're a CEO this morning watching us, you should say, OK, the sovereign wealth fund may be coming and trying to effectively buy in some kind of equity stake.
It's possible. Yeah, that's absolutely right. You know, that if in the past, the federal government has been giving money away lickety-split to companies, and the taxpayers have received nothing in return. And so now what's happening with the Intel deal is the CHIPS Act money is going out as planned, but instead of it just going out and disappearing into the ether, the U.S. taxpayers are getting a little bit of equity. I can really not see how anyone would think that's a bad thing, unless you thought that the government was then going to go in and run the company. But these are going to be shares that don't have voting rights. The government's going to stay out of it.
Well, it goes back a little bit to the Ronald Reagan quote that I started with, which is when, for many, many years, you know, you and I used to have conversations about Solyndra and how I think you thought that was a terrible, terrible mistake for the U.S. government to be getting involved in. We have been exporting the idea of a free market around the world for as long as I can remember, and this is a major shift. Do you not agree?
No, I think this is a very special case of Biden committed the money. You know, President Trump and Howard Lutnick weren't very clear that they wanted to continue to let the money go out because the paths weren't being crossed, the hurdles weren't being crossed. And so I think it's a very special case. But again, the general principle that if the U.S. government is able to create a situation that benefits everybody, then it should benefit the taxpayers too.
But if you're saying that this is really just the beginning of more as it relates to a sovereign wealth fund or something else, it would be suggestive of something very different. And I wonder how we in the United States and maybe even around the world should think about the idea of national champions, which is something that we've been, and the Republican Party in particular, has been quite critical of for years.
No, I mean, we're absolutely not in the business of picking winners and losers, but this is not a thing that is unprecedented. If you look at it right now, the U.S. government owns most everything of Fannie and Freddie. And the president, led by Bill Pulte and Howard Lutnick and Scott Bessent, are studying what should we do with that equity in Fannie and Freddie right now. They've been bringing in Wall Street leaders to discuss it as well. And so it's not unprecedented for us to have a little bit of equity in something. And again, what President Trump wants to do at all points in time is maximize the value of taxpayer dollars.
Well, let me ask you this then. In terms of improving the future of Intel, one of the things that it needs more than anything else is demand for its chips. which it does not have at the moment. And so there's two ways to get there. One is just make better chips, which they need to do. But the other is they're going to have to find customers. And the question is whether you believe that this administration is going to use its influence with other companies that would otherwise be the buyers of these chips to buy said chips. We had a period of time, remember, where Gina Raimondo in the Biden administration was trying to persuade Amazon and so many other companies to buy these chips unsuccessfully at the time, but criticized, if I remember, by Republicans for doing such a thing. So do you believe that someone from the administration is going to call up any of the tech companies and say, you know, you're building a data center, we'd love for you to use Intel chips?
No, I don't expect that's what's going to happen. I think what is going to happen is with the cash inflow that they've gotten, in addition to some money from outside private funders, Intel's going to get its act together and once again become the leader in chip space.
Can I ask one related question? Because I wonder if you think there's a historical sort of rewrite of history. Some people have suggested that the Biden administration should have taken equity the first time around when the CHIPS Act was first put in place. And the reason I'm curious about that is because I think at the time it was clearly to incentivize chip companies to come to the United States, do business, build fabs, and that fabs at the time were considered uneconomical, meaning companies didn't want to do this unless they could be subsidized. Now, maybe you could argue that given the tariff regime that's been put in place, it's changed the economics of what the playing field looks like today. But at the time, I think it would have been very difficult to go to these companies and say, I'm going to give you cash, you're going to give me equity, because I think they would have said to you, then please don't give me the cash. Am I wrong?
Well, again, if you're a company that's losing money, the equity doesn't have much, if any, value. And the bottom line is that President Trump is building an America First agenda that includes, as you say, tariffs, which will make it so that people are much more incented to bring their production onshore. And so 100%, we expect that companies like Intel that are onshoring production are going to become increasingly profitable because of the president's trade policy.
Kevin, it's Will Fair. I wanted to move the conversation on to the Fed. Did you welcome the tone of the chair's speech on Friday, the pivot, I guess, that started to appear?
Right. Yeah, I think that the pivot was accurate. It was data-driven. You know, if you look at the trailing 6-month inflation rate, it's 1.9%. Core is about 0.5% higher than that. And so inflation has gone way down. Meanwhile, the economy is looking strong, but not too strong. And so I think it's appropriate for the Fed to consider now doing what federal funds futures markets are saying they're going to do, and that's cutting rates. And so I think that the Fed's a little bit late to the game, but I thought that the presentation that Jay Powell made up at Jackson Hole was sound.
Maybe there's still time for Jay Powell to have his term extended, and you won't be considered as the replacement.
Oh, shucks, I don't know.
You think it's impossible to get back in the president's good books for Jay Powell?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
And when do you think he'll make up his mind, the president, for the vacancy there?
Well, Secretary Bessent is running a thorough search process. There are a number of really excellent candidates being interviewed by him and the president, and I would expect that this would run out for another few months before the president decides.
Kevin, Leslie Picker here. I'm curious kind of where things stand with the Section 232 review, especially in light of the strategy with Intel, with MP Materials. How are you strategically looking at kind of protecting national security crown jewels in this country, given the tariff picture as well as the potential to take stakes in certain companies?
Right. Well, you know, we've got 232 investigations and 301 investigations, and then also tariff deals that were cut left and right. You know, we've got the Koreans coming in today to hopefully finalize the deal. And the bottom line is that, as you saw earlier in the spring with the rare earths and the magnets, that it's unacceptable if a potential adversary has control, a chokehold on the American economy. And President Trump's team has studied the U.S. economy and studied our trade patterns with foreign countries, and they're identifying things that need to be onshored more for national security reasons. And so that's what's going on with that.
Kevin, I'm really interested in a broad point here, and not the specifics, and I know you wouldn't try and comment on how a foreign government should should run themselves. But a country like the UK, a deep ally of the US's, who's already done the trade deal in large part going forward, should the UK, you know, the big part of the discussion, as you know better than I, with all sorts of different trading partners, has been the topic of non-tariff barriers and different tax structures and things like that that the president wanted to be removed. And then we see a deal like this with Intel, where the government is taking a big stake and helping with investments. State support might be a generous phraseology, but it's not a million miles from that. Should countries like the UK think along the same lines? Should we invest in domestic champions to try and compete, or would that count as a non-tariff barrier that we're not allowed to do?
Oh, I don't think it's a non-tariff barrier. If you look at the non-tariff barriers, they're literal barriers, right? They're things that say, for example, if the food is genetically modified, or if we have Roundup on the fields or something, then we're not allowed to ship the agricultural products. And one of the things I think is a great victory of all the trade deals that we've been striking with President Trump's leadership is that we're doing away with those non-tariff barriers so that we will be able to, after this Korean deal, sell U.S. cars in Korea. We will be able to sell U.S. agricultural products into Europe. We'll sell beef to the UK. And so I think it's a completely different thing. And again, the Intel deal is something that we inherited from the Biden administration, a commitment to give them chips money. And we made a better deal than Biden did. And that's why the U.S. Shareholders, or U.S. taxpayers own about 10% of the company.
Can I ask you a slightly different question about tariffs? And I'm sure you've heard the same thing. If you talk to some of the automobile makers, for example, they will tell you that we are, because of the way the tariffs are set up, and even the costs in the United States of building cars here, that actually we're creating our own silos. So this idea that we're going to be exporting our cars to other countries, we may have the opportunity to do such a thing, but we can't do it in a competitive way relative to the other car makers that are outside of the country, China, obviously, and some others. And so I'm curious how much business you think we ultimately pick up with the quote-unquote opportunity to export versus the opportunity to just raise prices here in the United States?
Oh, I think there's an enormous amount of opportunity to pick up business. And the way to think about it is that we've got countries like Korea and associations like the EU where they have their own regulations for cars, and unless the car passes exactly those regulations, then we're not allowed to ship the car there. And they could be very, very different from what you're allowed to do if you're going to sell a car here in the U.S. And if you're thinking about selling an American car into Korea, then retooling a whole factory to meet the Korean regulatory standards just doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I think that harmonizing on those regulations has been a key feature of the trade deals that we've been negotiating, and it will absolutely open up markets for U.S. products.
Okay. Kevin, it's great to see you this morning. We appreciate you taking the time on this final week of August. Just as busy for you and I, but hopefully some people are watching us from the beach. Thanks.
Yeah, like Joe.
For their sake.